Alone in the Dark. The original working title for the game was simply In the Dark, but it went through many during development. To name just a few: The Doorstep of Terror, The Terror Behind the Doors, The Nightmare Vault, The Stalker of Nightmares, Lucid Horror, and one that makes me laugh, Fear Estate. There was a time, when the game was near completion, that it was linked to the Call of Cthulhu. There's a long story there I'll be getting into later, but then its title was The Doom of Derceto. After that, it was back to In the Dark, a name that can still be seen on the in-game menus. But that title didn't seem distinct enough. Steps in the Dark was suggested, Scream in the Dark considered, but finally they went with Alone in the Dark. The floppy disk version, which is the one I'm playing, starts with a bit of copyright protection. The game came with a little book filled with pairs of pictures, 256 pages. The game gives you a page number and you tell it which pictures are on that page. The CD-ROM version, released 2 years later, eliminated this. After the copyright protection, the game begins with a choice of two protagonists, Emily Hartwood or Edward Carnby. There's no functional difference between them. The character models and their background stories are the only things that set them apart, but I'll be showing a little of both, starting with Carnby. There is a lot of text in this game. The CD-ROM version added truly horrible voice acting, but I'm playing the original release. I won't be reading the text aloud in full. If you want to read it, I leave it up long enough for you to do so. Instead, I'll be summarizing the pertinent sections and quoting only those parts that serve as hints for later puzzles. Carnby, it seems, is a down-on-his-luck private investigator who has just accepted a curiously well-paying job to go check out an old piano that's piqued some antique dealer's interest. The piano is at a place called Derceto. The house has got quite a haunted history. Most recently, it was owned by one J. Hartwood, who not long ago hanged himself in the loft. And that's just where we're heading. The working scenario for the game, which its creator, Frédéric Reynal, had pinned to the wall during development, was only 3 words long: Get out alive. It was inspired by a poster for the Amityville Horror, showing a sinister-looking house with the words "For God's sake, get out" superimposed over it. The very first piece of concept art for the game, drawn in white chalk on black paper, featured a silhouetted man holding up a lantern that faintly illuminates a dark room. The genesis of Carnby. The heads of the two player characters, Emily and Carnby, use voxels for facial details, and were the last graphical elements to be added to the game. In development, simple spheres were used as stand-in heads. If you look closely at the passengers in the car of this opening cinematic, you can see some remnants of those sphere heads. The heads still hadn't been finished when it came time for the box to go to the printers, so for the screenshots on the back, an illustrator hand-drew faces on the spheres that look nothing at all like the in-game faces. Later printings replaced these with screenshots from the finished game. From the very outset, 2D sprites were abandoned for the characters and objects. They were always intended to be 3D. The reason the backgrounds weren't in 3D as well was a matter of processing power. The game was designed to run on a 386, and it doesn't assume you have a math coprocessor, so floating point calculations have to be done in software. In other words, home PCs of the time simply weren't up to the task of rendering that many polygons at an acceptable frame rate. Originally, the backgrounds were going to be photos of a real mansion in France, but a number of factors caused that idea to be abandoned. The biggest is that the perspective the 3D objects in the game are rendered in is not exactly true to life. It's simplified to make the calculations faster. With the backgrounds designed to this same slightly off perspective, it isn't noticeable. So the backgrounds were hand-drawn in Deluxe Paints, Deluxe Paint 2 for MS-DOS most likely. Yael Barros was the chief background artist. In my opinion, it's very good the original idea failed. The great difference in definition between the background and characters is less apparent, given that both are similarly colored and not overly detailed. Had the backgrounds been photorealistic, the juxtaposition between them and the characters would have just been distracting. And here we are in the loft of Derceto, where Hartwood killed himself. Carnby strikes a dashing figure, doesn't he? I think I see the piano. We were paid good money to go look it over, so let's check it out. The 3D objects were designed by Didier Chanfray. Some of the animations were modeled on Reynal himself. There's a funny story there, but first the piano. Carnby's no expert, but even he can see it's in pretty bad shape. I don't think Gloria Allen will be too interested in this. Maybe there's something else in this attic that might be valuable. That rocking horse looks nice. It's not just the player and enemy characters. All the objects in the game that can be interacted with are rendered in true 3D, including those that don't serve any purpose at all, like this guy. What was that? What is that? Well, whatever it is, I bet it won't like a kick in the face. Pressing the spacebar puts us in a fighting stance. From it, the directional keys each perform a different fighting function. There are 3 unarmed combat moves to choose from. You can punch with either your right or left hand, or you can kick. The punches are faster but have little range. The kicks are slower but allow you to stand farther back where it's safer. Originally there was a 4th move, the headbutt, but this was taken out of the final game. The creators thought it looked too silly. Some documents claim that Carnby has stronger punches and Emily stronger kicks, but that simply isn't true. Both will take this monster down in 10 kicks or punches. What the hell? Carnby came here to check out a piano, not to kick eldritch abominations to death. Seriously, if Gloria Allen wasn't paying us $150, that's nearly $2,000 in modern money, then... oh, now what? Right, this is crazy. Forget Gloria's money, we're getting out of here. This is the funny story I mentioned. Reynal wanted the characters to be able to run, but Chanfray didn't see how you could run in such a small space. So Reynal demonstrated this bizarre shuffling jog between 2 desks in the office, and that's exactly how Chanfray modeled Carnby's run animation. Now, let's run far away from this horrible place. Huh. Well. See you later, Carnby. Now let's try that again as Emily. Emily was Jeremy's niece, by Jeremy I mean Jeremy Hartwood, late owner of Derceto. She feels drawn to the place. She has to know why her uncle killed himself. His last words to her were to look closely at the piano in the loft. She reasons there must be a letter secreted away somewhere inside that will explain. The original intent behind having 2 protagonists was that the game would change depending on whether you played as Carnby or as Emily. Different puzzles, different clues, perhaps different endings. As the deadline for release grew near, however, that idea had to be scrapped. Emily and Carnby's missions became identical. Another reason that Reynal included the option of a female protagonist was because he thought it would entice women to play the game. At this time, video games were an overwhelmingly male-dominated pastime. But compare Emily Hartwood to Lara Croft, created some 4 years later. Emily is a middle-aged woman, modestly dressed. There's nothing fan-servicey about her. Granted, at 114 solid-colored polygons, fan service would be difficult, but to this day, Emily Hartwood remains one of the few female protagonists genuinely created for a female player's sensibilities. The only preceding example I can think of is Rosella from King's Quest IV. At the time work began on Alone in the Dark, King's Quest IV was the most recent addition to the King's Quest series, so it is possible that Rosella served as some inspiration for Emily. Internally, Carnby is called Man Zero, and Emily is called Man 2. You might think this suggests a hidden third character, but no. Rather, it points out the difference in thinking between programmers and artists. The early prototype player, which eventually became Carnby, was made by a programmer, who, like a computer, thought it natural to begin counting at 0. Emily, on the other hand, was made by a designer. In their minds, counting begins at 1. Since Emily was the second character, the designer numbered her Man 2. One shortcut the creators intended to take was to use the same animations for both Carnby and Emily, but it turned out that the models for the two characters were simply too different to make that work and not look terrible on one or the other. All of Emily's animations were redone to fit her model. Although Carnby was written first, and would become the de facto protagonist of the series, I've always thought that, in the context of this story, Emily has much more reason to be here, and a personal interest not only to escape, but to uncover the clues left by her uncle, and to piece together the story of his death. Emily's monologue also gives several major clues that Carnby's does not. Something about an old clock, a secret passage in the library, and of more immediate concern, the fact that Jeremy had pushed the old wardrobe in front of the loft window. I think we had better barricade that window as well. But first, a note about controls. Emily walks in the direction she's facing by pressing the up arrow key. She backs up by pressing down. She rotates left and right with left and right. To run, you double tap up. The speed of your tap matters, and it can take a bit of practice to get right. It gets progressively more finicky the faster your computer is. By pressing enter, we see our inventory, which is currently empty, and Emily's actions. She can fight, she can open and search things, she can close doors, and she can push objects. With Emily set to push, let's get that wardrobe in front of the window. The bird monster, that Carnby saw fly in through the window, spawns 60 seconds after the game starts. The demoing of the controls took up most of that time, so we had better hurry. Luckily, the wardrobe only needs to touch the window, not block it completely to count. Let's see if we got him. Here he comes. The zombie is not on a specific timer. It spawns shortly after the bird is either killed, however long that takes, or it's prevented from entering. There was no hints for blocking the trapdoor, but given our success with blocking the window and the conveniently placed chest, it's a natural conclusion. This first room sets the tone well for what Alone in the Dark is. There are enemies, and you can fight them, but there's usually a safer way. Combat is occasionally necessary, but reading between the lines and using the clues provided to solve puzzles is what the game is all about. We'll change Emily over to Open Search, in future I'll be cutting this out, and examine the piano now that the loft is safe to explore. Aha! It must be Uncle Jeremy's suicide letter. Maybe it will explain why he hanged himself. The master and his slaves will find his body, but won't have his soul. What does that mean? Who is the master? And why would he want Uncle Jeremy's soul? I'm serious, why would he? In French, it actually reads, "They'll find my body, my lifeless body," which, once you know the plot of the game, makes infinitely more sense. The translation is, on the whole, very good, but this one line in this one letter was changed for some reason. Our inventory space is limited. Having read the letter, we no longer need to carry it around. If, for whatever reason, we need it again, we can always pick it back up. Now, what else is there to see up here? An old Indian cover. Something like a wall tapestry. It might be useful. A rifle, this will definitely be useful. But only 4 cartridges. Ammunition is in short supply in this game. We'll have to make each shot count. The floor is invisibly divided into several zones. Stepping on some trigger the camera angle to change. There are 170 distinct angles in the game. This room can be viewed from 5 different directions. Most rooms have between 2 and 4 views. We found our first of many books, which are the main source of sometimes oblique hints for future puzzles. This one is from the Myth of the Golden Fleece, and was published by Hesperides Publications. That's unusual. It might not mean anything, but keep that name in mind for later. Perseus describes to Eumolpus how he'll polish his shield until it has a mirror finish, which will allow him to look indirectly at Medusa, and thus not be turned to stone, as their friend Ikios was. It doesn't seem significant now, but Emily will remember the myth's lesson. May Artemis guide us as though we were an arrow from her quiver. That's a rather strange expression. Emily will have to remember that too. I don't exaggerate when I say that this book contains more hints than anything else in the entire game. Keep it in mind, we'll be returning to it frequently. You may have noticed that the music has gone silent. There are just 8 tracks in the game, half of which only play once. We've so far heard Opening, Exploring Derceto, Evil Approaches, and Suspense and Intimidation. When a track finishes, the game is silent until another track is triggered. And finally, Chekhov's gun. Wait, no! It's a Lux oil lamp! Truly miraculous! Completely shock-resistant, with an extra-long wick and unbreakable glass. Hours of trouble-free light, guaranteed! Or at least, so says the advertisement in the Mystery Examiner. August 25th, 1924 edition. The cover story is, of course, about the suicide here at Derceto. Poor Uncle Jeremy. But anyway, without oil and matches, the lamp isn't of much use. The copy protection book and the newspaper are the two feelies the original release came with. There are no hints in the paper, but it does report on Jeremy's suicide. There's also an article about his artwork. It's yet to be established, but he was a professional painter. And an installment of Howard Hartwood's serial fiction, The Last Voyage of the Vulture. It also has a brief biography and bibliography of H.P. Lovecraft, in addition to several relevant advertisements. On the third floor, right away, we find a bow. It looks to be of a Native American design, with a peculiar feather decoration. If we ever find some arrows, it could come in handy. On the shelf, there's an oil can. We can use it to fill our lamp. Of course, Emily still has no way of lighting it, but that could change. Let's step into the hallway, this time avoiding the weak floorboards, if we can. This music usually signifies the presence of an enemy, but this is the first of a couple of the game's fake-outs. There's no enemy in this hallway. Emily isn't too comfortable leaving the door open. Before we start searching this room, we should close it, so we aren't exposed to attack. Strange painting. Seems to be a cherub holding a mirror. And this painting. Something vaguely Western about it. I think it's the hat. And the cover. Looks a bit like the cover Emily picked up in the loft. Anyway, what about this chest? Locked. And that's an example of a good translation. This is the North American release. In the European version, it says the chest is closed, which is a literal translation from the French game, but it makes no sense in English. Perhaps... Yes, there's a key in the desk. To use items, simply select them and press the spacebar in front of whatever you want to use them on. A cavalry saber. It looks like an antique, like something from the Civil War. But it still seems to be sharp. Let's have a look at it. Fighting with a bladed weapon works the same as hand-to-hand, with the same variations in style, but it gives you much greater range and attack strength. With swords, there's one additional move, a parry, but that only comes into play when your opponent is also wielding a sword. It seems I misspoke earlier. I said there was no enemy in the hallway. I meant to say there wasn't one yet. I didn't actually need to close this door. Closing it triggers a zombie to spawn on the other side. If the door doesn't close, the zombie doesn't appear. However, had I not closed it, the moment I stepped on this rug, it would have closed automatically. There is a trick. If you hug the wall, you can reach the desk and get the key, and back to the chest and get the saber, without ever crossing the rug. If you do, the door stays open and no zombie appears. Emily didn't need the rifle, and I doubt she'll need any other weapon she might find, but something tells me that this saber is special. Across the hallway is a dressing room. This room is nearly the opposite of the first. A zombie spawns at the head of the hallway when Emily crosses through the door. It will track her into the room, taking 4 or 5 seconds to appear, if she doesn't close the door on it. Although the player may not, Emily knows well what the adjoining room is. This was Emily's bedroom, when she stayed with her Uncle Jeremy as a child. The mirror on the desk is smashed. Odd. Nothing else in the room seems disturbed. I think Emily should get ready for a fight. Meanwhile, I'd like to take this time to say that the hallway and first 2 rooms of this floor show that the creators had a perfect grasp of the limitations of an adventure game and used them to their advantage. Think of any adventure game, say King's Quest. The majority of your playtime isn't spent in solving puzzles, it's spent in tediously walking from one place to another. Alone in the Dark adds an element of tension to mundane tasks like opening doors or traversing rooms. It also makes it clear, from the very outset, that not only are the monsters you come across against you, the very house itself is your antagonist. The rifle packs quite a punch. That taken care of, let's examine the room. The dresser is predictably locked, but since this is Emily's room, she knows where the key is. The throwing mechanic is more than a little buggy. It was added early in development, and they intended to replace it in the final game with a more realistic throw action. But it slipped through the cracks and they ran out of time. Two small mirrors. Mirrors that look very much like the one in the cherub painting across the hall. Before I leave this room, a word on the bird. There are 2 triggers that spawn the bird monster. The first is what I did, wait in the room for 60 seconds. The second is to pick up the vase. The latter leaves you wedged between the bed, the wall, and the table, with no room to maneuver and a very unfavorable camera angle. And that's the guy we closed the door on. You'll notice it's a child zombie. Child zombies aren't any stronger than their grown-up counterparts, but they are more dangerous. Because they're shorter, their upper body doesn't sway as much when they move. That means their animation loop is shorter by nearly half, and that means they can strike almost twice as fast. The 3rd floor bathroom. It doesn't seem to have a toilet, but there is a medicine cabinet. With a first aid kit. That contains a flask. Bottoms up, Emily.
Ah.
Liquor as a healing item is a running theme in the Alone in the Dark games. Emily starts out with 20 HP, but that isn't her maximum. She actually doesn't have a maximum, so there's no need to hang on to healing items. You might as well use them right away. The mirror is smashed here, too. It seems like somebody doesn't want to see their reflection. And the water appears to be off. Not that Emily has any need of it right now. When they can't see you, the zombies will walk a set path. Since he doesn't see me now, the game must consider the hole in the floor to be a wall. Whoa. So, there's a Stygian gargoyle blocking the way downstairs. Both sets of stairs, it would seem. Emily would be more surprised, but given that these monsters don't seem to be attacking... Look at that statue over there. It bears a strong resemblance to the one in the cherub painting. And its arms, it looks like it's made to hold something. All of the mirrors on this floor have been broken, except for the two that Emily carries. There's another statue on this side. Perseus used a mirror to look at Medusa. But what would happen if Medusa looked into one herself? The mirror fits, and the monster certainly doesn't like it. With the other mirror in place, they should be able to see one another. And with that, the path down to the second floor is clear. Hopefully, Emily won't encounter anything else between her and the front door. Now seems like a good time to save. The main menu is accessed with the Escape key. From it, we can save at any time. We have 6 save slots. If it's your first time playing, you should save frequently. And be sure to change slots now and then in case you find yourself backed into a corner and need to restart from earlier in the game.